He locked the door with 2 turns and checked the window again, even though he knew no one was following him. Raymond Ray Collins, 51, a Gulf War veteran, lived like a shadow on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona, in a small house surrounded by tall pine trees, where the wind made noises that only he seemed to hear. There was no traffic, no sirens, no neighbors knocking on the door. This was exactly how he wanted it, or at least how he had learned to endure it. Every morning started the same. A cold cup of coffee in his shaking hands, his eyes fixed on the door, his breathing controlled as if he were about to enter a combat zone. The past still lived with him, in the creaking of wooden walls, in dreams that woke him screaming, in the distant sound of helicopters that weren't always real. The diagnosis? Post-traumatic stress disorder, severe anxiety attacks, chronic insomnia. But those clinical words didn't capture the reality. Ray didn't just suffer from PTSD, he suffered from the absence of a home within himself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, folded almost impersonally. He knew the contents before he opened it, a negative response from the National Service Dog Program. It had been polite, formal, but cruel in its coldness. Due to budget cuts and a long waiting list, you are not eligible at this time. It wasn't a surprise. It was just another closed door. Another reminder that he was no longer anyone's priority. He sat there, on the edge of the kitchen sink, staring at the floor for long minutes. The air seemed thicker, as if something was sinking inside him. That letter was not just a denial. It was the final stamp of the idea that he needed help, that he had no value in and of himself. He closed his eyes for a second and whispered, as if speaking to someone invisible, "I can't even get a dog." But it was in that moment of silent defeat that a strange thought emerged, an almost childish impulse, irrational, stubborn. What if he trained a dog himself? The idea seemed absurd. Ray had never even trained himself to face his fears. But something inside him, perhaps the same instinct that had kept him alive in the war, told him it was time to try. Not for glory, but for survival. 2 days later, he walked into a rural shelter, smelling of disinfectant and loneliness, and emerged with a wild-haired, wary-eyed mixed-breed puppy. The puppy was excitable, anxious, difficult to control. He had no pedigree, no history. But there was something about him that Ray recognized immediately. Distrust and fear. It was familiar. This was himself in dog form. Ray called him Chance. Not because it was a pretty name, but because they both only had one chance. One chance. One single attempt to fix something, even without knowing where to start. Their first night together was chaos. The dog kept pacing in circles. He barked at the mirror, scratched at the door, growled at his own reflection. Ray tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths, repeating phrases he had learned from his patrol days. But deep down, everything seemed to be falling apart. He thought about giving up right there, opening the door, returning the dog, and going back to his silent world. But something stopped him. It wasn't courage. It was pride. Or maybe a last shred of faith. Because deep down, Ray wasn't trying to train a dog. He was trying to train himself. Have you ever felt like this? Like the only thing that could still rescue you was something no one else believed in. Stay with me, because what happens next may surprise you. Because on the journey of a broken man and a directionless dog, something extraordinary began to be born. And everything changed on a seemingly ordinary morning. The sound of the puppy's unsteady footsteps echoed through the house as a constant reminder that nothing was under control. Chance ran from one place to the other, knocking over everything he could find. Pillows, pots, old magazines that Ray had kept since before the war. Sometimes he would stop in front of the living room mirror and bark at his own reflection, as if he didn't recognize himself, or as if he were facing an invisible enemy. Ray tried to contain the chaos. Short, firm, repeated commands. Sit, stay, don't. But Chance wouldn't obey. Not because he didn't want to. It was as if he was also caught up in an internal war. Each command seemed to confuse him even more, as if human words were too foreign a language for a dog who had only known abandonment. The nights were the worst. Chance would cry loudly, like an old whale, and Ray would pace the house the way he had on night patrols in the Gulf, silent, alert, his chest tight, and his eyes weary from searching for threats that weren't there. There was a particular moment in the early morning, always around 3:17 a.m., when Ray felt as if he were back in the medical tent, where he had lost his closest comrade in a nighttime attack. The smell of dust and blood would come back, even though he wasn't there. The muffled sound of gunfire would invade his mind, even though the world around him was quiet. One of those early mornings, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, Ray sat on the kitchen floor and leaned his head against the wall. Chance slowly approached, lying down beside him with a sigh that sounded more like an apology. But Ray didn't cry. He stiffened. Because in war, crying was dangerous. And, in a way, he had never left the battlefield. The next morning, he tried something different. Not a new command, but a gesture. He picked up a piece of cold bacon, sat on the porch floor, and offered it wordlessly. Chance approached cautiously, his eyes still wary, his body tense. When he took the food in his teeth, Ray didn't smile. But he didn't flinch either. It was the first moment they'd shared the same silence, and for the first time, it didn't feel hostile. But that small breakthrough didn't last long. The next day, Ray went into town to buy some dog food. When he returned, he found the house in disarray. Chance had torn down the curtains, overturned the trash can, and peed on the carpet. The bedroom door was scratched, as if the dog had been trying to find him. It was separation anxiety, something Ray knew all too well. But in that moment, what he felt was anger. Not at Chance, at himself. "I should have left you there," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. The dog hid under the table. He was trembling. Ray, realizing what he had done, fell to his knees. This wasn't about obedience, or discipline, or control. It was about something deeper. It was as if the dog was touching wounds that no one else could see. And that was exactly why it hurt so much. From that day on, Ray changed his approach. He stopped trying to teach commands and started observing. He noticed that Chance responded best to gentle repetition, that he needed routine, that quiet walks worked better than any formal training. And then, without realizing it, Ray began to rebuild his life around it, waking up at the same time, walking the same trail, feeding Chance with the same ritual, returning the same way. It was as if by creating a routine for the dog, he was creating a structure for himself, and within that structure, something began to shift. The panic attacks lessened. His hands shook less. The house felt less hostile. Chance was still restless, but there was something different in his eyes, a kind of silent connection, as if to say, "I'm still learning, but I'm here." One afternoon, while hiking on the trail beside the woods, a truck sped by on the nearby road. The dry sound of the exhaust exploded through the air like a gunshot. Ray froze. His body froze. His heart pounded. He fell to his knees, his hands on his head, the world spinning. But before the terror could take over, Chance ran toward him. He pressed himself against Ray's chest, pushed him back with his body, licked his hands. He hadn't been trained to do this. There was no command. It was pure instinct. And it worked. Ray, panting, came back to the present. Slowly, the sound of the forest replaced the buzzing in his head. The dog's touch, his breathing, his presence. All of it became an anchor. And there on the ground, among dry leaves and stones, Ray understood. Chance had saved him. Unintentionally, unknowingly. But he had saved him. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because of anxiety, but because of something new. A nagging thought, disturbing and yet hopeful. Could other veterans also go through this? Could other abandoned dogs also be a chance for someone? The question kept echoing in his mind. Ray had no answers. But for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, He wasn't so alone in this battle. If this touched you in any way, comment below. Maybe I just need a chance too. And believe me, what started as a desperate attempt was still far from showing the true impact it would cause. His breath was still coming in short bursts as Ray leaned back against the base of a gnarled pine tree, the rough dirt floor sticking to his palms. Chance lay there, unmoving, pressed against his chest, as if every beat of the dog's heart had been programmed to calm the man's inner storm. It was strange how the rambunctious pup, who months ago had been tearing up the living room cushions and growling at his own reflection, now seemed to have been shaped by a quiet intelligence. But Ray knew it wasn't magic. It was familiarity. It was trust built drop by drop in a routine that no one saw, but that was all that sustained his days. Over the next few days, Ray began to take notes on Chance's behavior. He watched the dog jump up and down in alarm before he even realized the seizures were starting. He would move forward, positioning himself between Ray and anything that seemed to pose a threat. Outside the grocery store, Chance would bark only at certain people, those who spoke too loudly or approached too quickly. And when Ray was feeling sick, as he had after hearing a distant siren while driving, the dog would scratch restlessly at the inside of the car door until Ray stopped and took a breath. It was as if the dog was learning to decipher him, as if he had a secret manual that even doctors had not been able to write down. But this quiet progress wasn't appreciated by everyone. On a rare trip downtown, Ray stopped with Chance on the sidewalk in front of the drugstore. As he waited, two men in local police uniforms walked by, casting a sidelong glance. "Careful there, sir," one of them said, pointing to the dog. "That kind of dog, without identification, could be considered an aggressive animal." Ray just nodded, but inside he felt the old metallic taste of shame. That look, cold, assessing, as if he were a walking hazard, brought back the worst moments of the post-war era. The moment when, still dressed in his military uniform, he was told by a store manager that he was not fit to work with the public. The moment when, trying to rent an apartment, he heard the realtor ask if he was emotionally stable. But the worst thing was the constant feeling of not belonging, of being a foreigner in his own country, and not even Chance, with all his devoted attention, could protect him from that. That night, Ray had another nightmare. He was in a conflict zone. Smoke, bodies on the floor, a radio blaring incoherent orders. When he woke up, the sheets were soaked with sweat, and Chance was already there, lying next to the bed, his nose pressed against his hand, as if he knew that right now, in that moment, it was enough to be present. Ray closed his eyes again and murmured, "I don't know what I would do without you." He was changing, but it still wasn't enough. Unintentionally, what was happening there went far beyond simple training. Ray was relearning how to live through consistency, through small milestones, through emotional discipline. What had started as a desperate gesture was becoming a survival system, and he wasn't the only one who understood it. One random Saturday, as they were walking along the gravel road beside a neighbor's ranch, a boy of about 10 years old ran up to the fence and yelled, "Is this a war dog?" Ray smiled for the first time in weeks. "He is peaceful," he replied. But the answer wasn't just a nice phrase. It was true. Chance was the link between two worlds that seemed irreconcilable: the military past and the civilian present, chaos and stability, pain and overcoming. Ray began to feel, for the first time in decades, that his existence had a function outside the walls of memory. It was in this context that an unexpected moment happened. On a longer hike, Ray had another breakdown. He was alone with Chance, and a powerful memory hit him when he smelled burning oil in the air. The collapse was sudden. He fell into a sitting position, arms wrapped around his chest, the world spinning as if he were in hostile territory again. But this time, Chance didn't just comfort him. He barked, loudly, firmly, over and over, until he caught the attention of a man walking by with a camera on his shoulder, recording footage for a documentary about local trails. The cameraman ran towards them, saw the dog pressing its owner, and instinctively recorded part of the scene. I'm an ex-Marine too, the man said, placing his hand on Ray's shoulder. What he's doing. This is unbelievable. That same day, the video was sent to a veterans organization that worked on mental health projects. And without Ray having any intention, the video went viral. Within a week, his inbox was flooded with messages from retired servicemen, mothers of soldiers, therapists, shelter owners. People from all over the country wanted to know, how did he do it? How did a veteran living alone in rural Arizona manage to train a dog with no resources and even use it as a tool to combat severe emotional crises? The messages varied, but they all had one thing in common: hope. But not everyone was ready to accept this new narrative. A national organization that regulates emotional support dogs issued a blunt statement warning of the risks of untrained veterans training their own dogs. A military psychologist commented in a radio interview that such cases could romanticize a dangerous and unprofessional practice. Ray listened to that in silence, and it hurt. How it hurt. It was as if, once again, the system was saying, you are not authorized to try. But there was something different now. For the first time, he was no longer in a position to take orders. He could do something on his own. And it was at that exact point that everything really began to change. Write in the comments. I'm also trying to relearn. Because what came next? No one, not even Ray, could have imagined. He opened the door with a hesitant hand, like someone turning a rusty key after years of not touching the latch. The wind outside hit Ray's face with symbolic force. It wasn't just fresh air. It was the first sign of a world he'd sworn never to revisit. Inside the house, Chance watched with his ears pricked and his body ready, as if he knew something important was happening. On the sidewalk lay an envelope. No official stamp, no return address, just carefully folded. Inside was a handwritten letter from a retired Navy veteran. The words were simple, almost raw. I saw you on the video. I thought it was a montage.
But if it's true, if you trained that dog yourself, then maybe there's hope for us too.
Ray held the paper for long minutes. The words burned as if they were addressed to the most hidden part of him. The part that still felt untrustworthy and unappreciated. Chance nuzzled his leg, and for the first time, Ray felt that he wasn't just being helped. He was somehow being called. As if the dog's silent gesture was saying, you have a mission. In the following days, the messages multiplied. Some came from mothers who had lost children in the war and were anxiously caring for their grandchildren alone. Others came from retired soldiers who had tried everything: medication, therapy, isolation, and nothing worked. Your dog is special, they said. How did you do that? But Ray didn't know how to respond, because really, he still wasn't sure if he had done something, or if he had just survived along with someone else. Still, something inside him began to stir. A silent seed of responsibility. For the first time, he considered leaving the house to meet other people. But before he did that, he did something even more difficult. He wrote a post. It was short. No image, no video, no drama. I'm not a professional trainer. I'm just someone who was drowning and found a rope. If you're a veteran and want to try training your own dog, maybe we can learn together. The response was almost instantaneous. It wasn't virality. It was desperation in the form of gratitude. 4 messages from veterans from the city itself. All men and women who lived there, close to him, but who lived invisibly. All with different scars, but with the same question in their eyes. Is it possible to start over like this? The following Saturday, Ray met the first of them. He was a retired sergeant named Mitch, with a lined face and a shuffling gait. He had a pit bull mix named Duke with him, who had been rescued from an underground breeding facility. The dog was strong but fearful. He wouldn't let anyone touch him, except Mitch. Still, the two accepted Ray's invitation to go for a walk. Chance walked ahead, calm and attentive, and his presence seemed to calm Duke. At the end of the trail, Mitch took off his cap and said just one thing. I don't know what you're doing, but I needed this." Ray didn't answer, but he knew in that moment that the journey would be longer than he had imagined. The second veteran arrived a week later. Julia, a former Army paramedic, had a firm gaze and a scar running across her left forearm. She was carrying a dog named Luna with an amputated leg in her arms. She said she had found the animal abandoned near a bridge and decided to take care of it because, according to her, 2 cripples were a good match. Her dry manner hid a pain that Ray knew all too well, the pain of no longer trusting anyone. But when she saw Chance slowly lie down in front of Luna, without imposing himself, without fear, Julia smiled. A short smile, but sincere. These meetings began to repeat themselves. One by one, veterans who had never crossed paths began to show up. All with stories no one wanted to hear. All with dogs no one wanted to adopt. Ray began to gather the group in an open field behind an old school, disused since the pandemic. It took them months to cut the grass, level the ground, and improvise fences. Nothing there was pretty, but every detail had purpose. Slowly, Ray began to share what he had learned, not as a teacher, but as a survivor. Repetition, patience, eye contact, no magic, no tricks, just consistency and presence. But it wasn't long before obstacles arose. One day, during one of the meetings, a city car pulled up at the entrance to the field. An employee, with a badge hanging around his neck and a clipboard in his hand, asked to speak. He said there had been complaints. Irregular gathering. Unauthorized activity. Improper use of public space. Ray tried to explain, but all he heard was, "If there is no documentation, we will need to close this down." That night, back at home, Ray stared at the wall of his dark bedroom for hours. His head was spinning. The old feeling of being held back, of always trying something with his own hands and being pushed back down. Chance lay down beside him on the rug. He didn't make a sound, but once again, he was there. And that simple act, that silent presence, rekindled an old decision in Ray. He wasn't going to give up. In the days that followed, he called on volunteer attorneys from the local Veterans Association. He contacted the shelter from which he had rescued Chance. He sent videos, reports, testimonials. For the first time, he put himself on the front lines for a civil cause, and strangely, he felt more alive than he had in his years of service. He didn't want glory. He wanted real impact. I wanted a space where pain had a purpose, where each scar served as a map to help someone get out of the abyss. And all this was born from a dog that nobody wanted. Comment here. Pain that becomes purpose. Alright, because just when it all seemed too hard to go on, a new door opened. And it wasn't just a boot camp. It was something much bigger. He pushed open the old barn door with both hands, the creak of its hinges breaking the morning silence. The wood was damp, the floor covered in dry leaves and accumulated dust. The structure was rickety, but Ray saw something few others could. A starting point. This abandoned space, ignored by so many, would now be the hub of an unlikely idea, a community training center for veterans and their shelter dogs. No signs, no sponsorship, no public funding. Just him, Chance, and the decision he had made so heartily. Don't let anyone else get lost in the dark alone. That same day, he called Mitch, Julia, and 3 other veterans who had written or shown up at the informal meetings. He told them he had a place. He needed help. He wanted to try something bigger. The response was immediate, not out of excitement, but out of necessity. These were people who had already lost so much that any spark of purpose was better than another day sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. They cleaned out the barn together. They cut weeds, mended fences, hung ropes, and created makeshift obstacles out of old tires and scrap wood. It was all precarious, but there was something there that even the most modern structure could not provide. Real connection. Every nail driven, every bucket of paint stirred, was a way of healing the past with one's own hands. But not everyone was happy about it. 2 days after the first official meeting at the space, Ray received a notice in his mailbox. The property was being monitored for illegal use for group activities. A neighbor, bothered by the barking and the parked cars, had filed a formal complaint. "It's not against you," he said, face to face, days later. "It's just, this isn't the place for that kind of thing." Ray listened in silence. He clenched his fists. The same clenched fist he had felt when he was discharged from active duty, with the protocol phrase, "Thank you for your service, but there is no longer a role for you here." It was always like that. Always someone saying he was out of place, that he didn't fit, that he was inconvenient. He went back home, locked the door, and sat on the living room floor, with his breath caught in his throat. Chance nuzzled his arm, but this time Ray didn't respond. He stayed there for hours, motionless, doubting, questioning everything. Was he really crazy? Was he forcing something he shouldn't? But then he remembered the letter. The retired Marine's shaky handwriting echoed like a whisper from someone who was still trying to exist. "If you could do it with Chance, maybe I can too." Ray picked up the sheet of paper and read it again. Then, without thinking, he hung it on the makeshift corkboard in the barn. And in that moment, he made the bravest decision since the day he first put on the uniform. Continue, even without guarantees. He called the group together. He set the first official day of training. He asked each veteran to bring not just their dog, but something personal. A story, an object, anything that would remind them why they were there. The next morning, the barn became a haven for quiet transformation. There were no cameras, no press, no promises of a cure. There was a man with PTSD and a dog no one wanted. And all around them, there were others like them. Broken, but not destroyed. Weary, but still breathing. Julia brought a service ID necklace. Mitch, a cracked medal kept in a cigar box. Another, a journal with torn pages where he wrote when the attacks came. Each object brought a pain. But together, they began to become language. Ray taught them the basics that day. Steady. Sit. Stay. But the real lesson was in the silence between commands, in the patience with which a veteran waited for a dog to make a mistake, in the almost uncomfortable tenderness with which someone praised a small accomplishment. Chance walked among them as a living symbol that it was possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. And then something extraordinary happened. At the end of practice, one of the quieter veterans, a tall, grey-haired man with calloused hands named Ben, slowly approached. It was the third time he had shown up, always with the same shy dog, rescued from an illegal kennel. But this day, something was different. "I never said that," he began, his voice low, his eyes filled with tears. "But I had already written my farewell letter 2 months ago. Everything was ready. But then I saw your video, and I saw what that dog did for you." He took a deep breath. "And I thought, what if my dog could do the same for me?" Silence. No one moved. It was as if the world had stopped for a second. Ray felt his throat tighten, but he didn't respond with words. He stepped forward and simply hugged him. It was brief, it was harsh, but it was sincere. And in that hug, everyone understood that this was no longer about dogs. It was about life, of choice, of second chance. That hidden truth, hidden behind the pain and fear, was now taking shape. Ray was no longer just a surviving veteran. He was a guide, a link, an anchor in a sea of veterans shipwrecked by silence. And that was just the beginning. Write in the comments, "Even broken, I still serve." Because in the coming weeks, something even stronger was about to be born. And no one had any idea how much it would grow. The sun had not yet broken through the morning fog when Ray lined up the makeshift cones in the field. The ground was damp, and dry twigs crackled beneath his boots. Chance was already positioned, alert, as if he knew that this day carried a special weight. Slowly, the others began to arrive. Mitch with Duke, head down but determined. Julia with Luna, now with a new blue collar she had sewn herself. Ben, always silent, with the dog still scared, but for the first time not pulling on the leash in fear. And others came too, one with a lame Labrador, another with a deaf mutt. They all had stories written in their eyes, and scars on their walks. Ray approached the group without raising his voice too much. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't protocol, it was an invitation. They started with simple commands, but the focus wasn't on sit or stay. The real training was in the way each learned to watch the other, as if the connection between human and dog revealed something deeper about the wounds that had never been spoken. One of them, Marcus, kept getting it wrong. The dog wouldn't respond. He'd get restless. He'd pull on the leash. And instead of giving up, Ray just said, "I'm here." You're trying to control him with fear. He's been through this before. He doesn't need order. He needs peace. At that moment, Marcus lowered his head. He said that was exactly how his father spoke to him when he returned from military service. He yelled, he controlled, he exploded. And on that field, in front of everyone, he understood that he was repeating the cycle. A cycle that could be broken. But as the group grew in unity, pressure from the outside was also mounting. A county official showed up with a clipboard and a formal warning. If they continued to use the land for unregistered gatherings, they could be fined or even removed. No word about its function, no questions about what they were building, just paperwork and a veiled threat. Ray took the document and signed for it without argument, but his heart was heavy. That night at home, he paced the floor as he had in the old days of vigil. Chance followed him silently. It was as if the ghost of the old system was trying to take over the space they had worked so hard to build. For the first time since the project began, Ray thought about quitting. Not for lack of will, but out of exhaustion. After all, how many times can someone start from scratch before breaking down completely? The next day, something unusual happened. A brown envelope, with no return address, was stuck to the fence of the field. Inside was a letter written in a firm handwriting. "I see what you're doing here. Don't stop. If you need a place, I have a property on the west side of town that's been sitting idle since my son passed away. He was a veteran, and he loved dogs." Along with the letter was a small photograph, a young man in uniform smiling, holding a Labrador puppy. On the back of the photo was a name, Ethan. Ray stood there, staring at the image for several minutes. Then he walked out to the field, gathered the group together, and read the letter aloud. There was nothing to say. Some bowed their heads. Others, like Julia, simply closed their eyes. But they all understood. They were no longer alone on this journey. Someone on the outside, someone who knew the pain firsthand, had reached out. With this new opportunity in hand, Ray did something few expected. He organized the group's first open event. A small community meeting with demonstrations of obedience, conversation circles, and a simple table of coffee and donuts. Nothing special. But for someone who had spent years trying to hide from the world, that was everything. The announcement was made through word of mouth, in timid posts on social media. But on the scheduled day, dozens of people showed up. Among them was a boy wearing a worn-out cap, accompanied by his grandmother. She told him that he had lost his father in Afghanistan, and that since then, he had been living in isolation, without talking to almost anyone. Chance was the first to approach. He sat down next to the boy, without asking for anything. He just stayed there. And after a few minutes, the boy rested his head on the dog and began to cry. Quietly, subdued. The grandmother covered his mouth with her hands. "He hadn't cried since the funeral," he said, his eyes filling with tears. This wasn't about dog training. It was about breaking the silence, about turning pain into connection, about creating a space where failures weren't seen as weaknesses, but as symptoms of a much bigger battle, one that was being fought within. And then came the most unexpected turn of all. A National Veterans Support Foundation based in Denver reached out. They had seen the videos, the letters, the stories. They wanted to visit the project in person, and what's more, they wanted to understand how to replicate it in other states. What had started as Ray's desperate attempt to train a dog to support his emotional burden was now being seen as a community transformation model. The day the representatives arrived, The field was clear. The dogs were lined up, and the veterans, the same ones who avoided talking to strangers, were ready to show something much bigger than training. They were ready to show that they had found their purpose again. Ray greeted them with the same firm voice as always, but when he turned to introduce Chance, his eyes filled with tears. "This is the dog that pulled me out of the darkness." And, without meaning to, pulled a bunch of people with him. Write in the comments, "This mission is bigger than me." Because when someone survives chaos and turns it into a path for others, they don't come back the same as they were before. They come back with purpose. And Ray was just getting started. The trail was covered in dry leaves, crunching under Ray's worn boots. The sky was clear, the cold air biting his face, but there was a strange calm to this morning. Chance walked 2 steps ahead, as he always did, but his tail wagged a little more lightly. They knew every curve of the path, every rock, every silence. Here, among the pines that danced in the wind, Ray felt whole. For the first time in years, he didn't have to run from his own mind. And it all started because of a dog that no one wanted. That trail, which had previously served only to escape the invisible walls of anxiety, was now also the place where he organized his thoughts. It was there that ideas for new partnerships were born, plans to expand training, drafts of projects involving shelters, community centers, and even public schools. But it was also there that he remembered those who had fallen by the wayside. Because no matter how much the program was growing, Ray never stopped carrying the weight of those he had not been able to reach in time. During a recent visit to a military base in transition, Ray met a young man named Eliwa. He was 27, with sunken eyes and hands that shook slightly. He was nearing the end of his active duty and about to return to civilian life, but he clearly already bore the invisible scars of war. They talked for half an hour. Elijah told him he was afraid to go home, afraid he wouldn't be able to sleep, afraid he would be just another number. Ray left his contact information and handed him a pamphlet with the name of the foundation and a simple sentence: "You don't have to face this alone." Weeks later, Ray received a message from Elijah's sister. The young man had taken his own life, not because his family didn't love him, but because he felt out of place in a world he no longer knew how to translate. Ray sat in silence for hours, staring at the name on the screen. Then he walked to the back fence of the new center, now with facilities, staff, and an official name, and nailed a small wooden plaque with Elijah's name engraved by hand. Because behind every victory, there was also a cruel reminder: this mission was urgent. Yet even as he bore these losses, Ray knew he couldn't stop. Because for the first time in decades, he wasn't just surviving. He was living for something bigger. Behind the scenes, the foundation was beginning to receive invitations to work in other states. Mental health organizations wanted to replicate the model. And even universities began to take an interest in the psychological impact of the bonds created between veterans and rescued dogs. The transformation that had once been just his and Chance's now became a collective journey. What had started as an attempt became a structure. What had been improvised became a program. And what had been pain became direction. During one of the conferences in Denver, Ray was called to the stage in front of more than 1,000 people. Next to him was Chance, older, calmer, with a slightly graying muzzle. When Ray took the microphone, the first thing he said was not about statistics or techniques. He simply took a deep breath and said, in a firm voice, "I'm not an animal behavior expert. I'm not a therapist. I'm just someone who almost gave up and was saved by a dog who had also been left behind." The audience fell silent, not with indifference, but with respect. This wasn't a lecture. It was a testimony. And every word Ray spoke resonated as a reminder that purpose doesn't come from comfort. It comes from pain that we transform into a bridge. Later, back at the center in Flagstaff, he received a letter unlike any other. It was from a 16-year-old boy who had lost his father in Iraq. In the letter, he said that he was bullied at school for having panic attacks, and that, after watching a video of the program, he convinced his mother to adopt a dog from a shelter. He named the dog Valor. And, in his words, "Now, when things get tough, I lean on valor." He understands me. And I remember that my father didn't want me to be strong alone. Ray held the letter for a moment, then walked over to the trophy room in the center. There were no medals, no gold plaques, just letters, tickets, photographs, little pieces of lives that had been touched by the same seed that had been planted that day when Ray decided to train Chance with his own hands. There was no vanity on that wall, only truth, and it was that truth that held everything together. He and Chance returned to the trail that late afternoon. The orange sky touched the treetops, the sound of crickets slowly appearing. They walked in silence. Ray had his hands in the pockets of his worn coat, and Chance was always 2 steps ahead. But that day, Ray did something different. He stopped, crouched down, and hugged the dog tightly. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was a thank you. Because Chance wasn't just the dog who saved him from a panic attack years ago. He was the symbol of everything that was still possible when you choose not to give up. Write in the comments. Sometimes the mission begins after the war. Because Ray's biggest transformation wasn't leaving the past behind. It was understanding that he could still be part of the healing of others, even though he, too, was in the process of rebuilding. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story spoke directly to you. Maybe it was Ray's silence, Chance's look, or that feeling that, even after everything, you can still start over somehow. If this message touched you, even if only for a moment, subscribe to the channel. Here, we build these stories with our hearts, for those who need to remember that they are not alone. And if this journey made sense to you, leave a comment. I continue on this mission, just so I know you were with me until the end. Oh, and if this video made you feel something real, leave a like. It's a small gesture, but it helps keep this connection alive and makes this space continue to exist for more people like us. There's a video here that will take you even deeper into this conversation. Click and continue with me there, because some stories don't end. They transform.